Welcome to my GDC talk, Ghost in the Machine, Authorial Voice in System Design. And I hope you are well in those bizarre times, and yes, the microphone is duct taped to my face. So, let's go with the topic at hand, and let's start with the basics. Who am I? My name is Marta Fijak. Currently, I'm a creative director at Anshar Studios, but for the past 5 years, I worked at 11-bit Studios as a game designer, senior game designer, lead game designer, and different things, working among others on Frostpunk. I did the society part of Frostpunk, which we are going to discuss briefly today, and I also had some, indie adventures and that kind of things. But you did not come here to listen about me. So let's get to the topic at hand. What is this authorial voice, this authorial intent that we are going to discuss? And this is actually the embedded worldview of the creator that is manifested in his work. And it can be transmitted through few different means, through the style, through the perspective, through the point of view, and through the tone. But the concept is that the experience of life for any one of us, it's not the same. And the work we are creating through our unique lens, kind of showing our inner workings and our perspective on everything. And of course, as this term comes from literature theory, there's a lot of discussion if the authorial intent is conscious or is subconscious, if the author has any control over it. But here, let's take it at face value, because this is not a lecture about literature theory, and we are going to talk about games. And also, I can't read. So, let's look at it through some examples from other medium than games. Then we'll get to the games. We'll discuss it on the games. But let's start with a movie and with a book, starting with the Catch-22. As you are probably aware, this is a book about war. One of many books about war. One of many books about World War II. But this one is kind of special, because many of the books tell the heroic stories and how the war is sometimes the necessity, and how, as it brings the wars, it also brings the best in people. But Catch-22 is the different book. The authorial voice is quite strongly heard in there, and is a unique perspective, at least at the time, about how nonsensical and how violent and how pointless war is. And the same with Everything Is Alright With Us, the book, the movie on the left. It is not about war, but some of the indie developers will tell you that it is about war, as this is a movie about developing games, about developing an indie game, but is extremely different in tone and different in how it portrays some things than Indie Game the movie. And again, I hope you can see that there is the same subject, like war and making indie games, in those two things, but the authorial voice, the authorial intent, the experience that is being told is vastly different. And that is kind of the point. Let's look at another example. Here we have two paintings. Both of them are showing the war. Both of them are showing atrocities of war, because both of them were created to kind of show how cruel and horrible is war. But we can see how vastly different is the lens of Pablo Picasso, and how vastly different is the lens of Francisco Goya. And at the time, both of those paintings did a huge thing. Like, people really resonated with that this is how the brutality of war looks. And if you look at those two, right, they cannot be more different. But this is that kind of transformative character of us embedding our own view of the world into the things that we are doing. And also, this is Saturn devouring his own children, and it is here because I kind of love this painting, and we don't know what the authorial intent was of it. We don't know why Francisco Goya painted it. It was never to be seen publicly, but it is, and I find it kind of fitting in terms of a game designer devouring his own game design. But that was just a tangent. Let's get back to the thing. So, the authorial voice itself, it's a matter of communication. We are communicating, and we are communicating through the things that we are doing. And sometimes the catch is that we do not do it consciously, but about that in a moment. First, let's kind of go through the idea the games are like that. So how does it work in games? How the authorial intent manifests in games? And this is for future lectures, not this one. This one is 30 minutes. But there's also the question of whose authorial intent is it? Especially when we are talking about not small indie games that are made by 2, 4, 5 people, but are made by companies of 10,000. Okay, we are not on that level of size of companies, but companies of couple hundred people, whose authorial intent is that. But just leaving it as a nugget, just stuck to that. You can think about it later if you would like. So, how does it work in games? How those things manifest? And of course, we've got the most obvious channels. The story, the written down plot points that are exactly the same for every player. And they're a very powerful tool to do that, especially in those movie-like games. Those really thrive on showing what they are trying to tell you through those story bits, which are then dressed in wonderful acting, voice acting, animations. But the story, it's the same like with movies. Story is a great transmitter, great way for the authorial intent. And another example is Disco Elysium, the game that really clearly states through its story, through its texts, through the static bits that do not change what is their worldview and what they are trying to say, and they are very conscious of that, which is great. And visuals. As you can imagine, as story is a kind of a parallel to a book, but of course we know that writing for games is vastly different than writing books, but the parallel exists. The visuals is a great parallel to paintings and, the usual flat, not a dynamic kind of art style. So, once again, this picture speaks 1,000 words. And what is wonderful also with communicating with art, that it is not bounded by the limits of our language, because both visuals and, in a second, audio are things that can communicate things that we cannot say. Still, how we depict certain characters, how we depict certain situations visually, show our view of those situations, show our view of those characters, because it's our choice, or our game director, still not that discussion, the view of that thing. Because the simple decision of what characteristic of the character we are going to enlarge and draw the focus to show what in our mind is important about that character. And this is our authorial intent, conscious or not. So here, Hellblade, wonderfully visually and wonderful game entirely, communicating in that aspect. And on the other hand, a vastly different kind of expression, still extremely successful and extremely clear on what it's trying to say through its visuals. And as I already pointed forward, there's also the audio. And here I'm talking more about the sound design, but of course it also applies to music. It allows us to convey some authorial intent when we are describing something. So here we've got one great example of audio design showing space from the point of view of fear and being terrified. And this is a game that, you need to change your pants afterwards, because it is so nicely done, and the audio design makes a lot of that. And on the other hand, space, exactly the same topic, can be vastly different and can be a place of wonder and curiosity, also thanks to its audio design, like in case of Outer Worlds. But Outer Wilds, sorry, two similar naming games, Outer Wilds. So that's all good and dandy, but there's that unique part about medium. So what with the mechanics? Are mechanics a way of communicating things, or are they just for fun? As you can imagine from the, talk title, I have my agenda in here, but in a moment, before we will jump to that, let's start with defining a vocabulary and some, quick, brief theoretical background, so we are talking about the same thing. Because as you know, there are many lenses and many different approaches that you can look on design through. So, to have it all clear, let's go with the Brian Upton definition from the wonderful book, The Aesthetic of Play. So, in this talk, I'm going to conceptualize game design and game as a free movement in the system of constraints. A quick summary for those of you who are not familiar with that. Highly recommend getting familiar with that. The free movement in a system of constraint is an approach that looks at a game as a set of states. And those states, if you are talking about chess, for example, every single combination of positions of different chess pieces is a different state. And what the player does is he moves freely through those states. So we, as designers, designing, for example, the rules of how the chess pieces move and what is the dimensions of the board, are dictating what kind of states the game will generate, right? So we, as designers, we create rules. Those rules generate states, and the player themselves walk through those states in that free movement in the system of constraints. So, just to sum it up, game consists of states that are created by us. This is the bare minimum that we need from that slide. And another layer of that is that not all games are similar. I know this is not something groundbreaking, but not all games are the same. And let's look on them from one perspective. Let's look on them in terms of how big of an impact basic mechanics have on the narration. And when I'm saying narration, just to be clear, I'm not saying the fixed plot points. I'm talking the whole story, the whole experience that is played in the player's mind while playing the game. Because due to the interactive nature of our medium, between two players, almost always that narration will be slightly different. And why it will be different? It will be different through the smallest of decisions that may not change how the game is perceived, but still the narration is slightly different because we decided to kill someone from the left and not someone from the right. But using that kind of logic, we can look on the games over in those two axes. So on the x-axis, we've got the impact of low-level mechanics on the narration itself. And the y-axis is how different those narrations can be out of that game. So how different stories will be created from players to players' head, right? How much difference there will be in the meaning itself. And also, left lower corner, we've got the movie-like experiences, those games that have a quite similar narration in the head of all of the players. The low-level mechanics do not have a big impact, and almost always the narration is more or less similar-ish, the same-ish. It's only those mundane details that no one cares are changing from player to player. Then, left upper corner, we've got the branching narrative. The low-level mechanics, for example, in Witcher 3, do not care so much from the narration. It does not matter how you are killing the monsters. It is important what kind of decisions you make in an important plot point moment. So it's a classical branching narrative. It is extremely effective to create the ownership of the story in the player, but it is also extremely pricey because there's a lot of content that you have to create. And on the right side, we have games that take a lot of its own narration from the low-level mechanics. So upper right corner, we've got the anecdote kind of generator. So the Rim Wars, the Dwarf Fortress, and the power of those stories is that they are uniquely personal. They're usually stories of disaster and everyone dying, your little colony kingdom, but still, it was your way of them failing, and it came from a very, very low level mechanic and how you played. But the thing is, I'm not sure that kind of anecdote generators are the best to convey certain meanings. If you want to convey a more complex idea, it would be harder with that kind of games. And that brings us to the last category that I, at this moment, find the most interesting. And this is those mechanical stories. So the game over on the higher level have quite strong idea that they want to convey, but how that narration develops is quite unique to the player because it comes from those low-level mechanics. So this is, I hope, how Frostpunk plays, this is how her story plays, because the outcome of that story for all of us is more or less the same, but all of us had a quite different and a unique experience how we got to that point, and I think this also makes this quite powerful. But why I'm bringing it now, because in terms of speaking through the mechanics, it is more important to look on that kind of subject when you are more on the right of this graph and not on the left. So, that is the end of intermission. Let's get back to the topic at hand. Mechanics. Do they convey something? And in my opinion, authorial voice manifests in all state generated by the mechanic. So our worldview, our view of certain experiences is embedded in them. And not directly because they are generated by the rules, but still, authorial voice manifests in state generated by the mechanics. And as so, this is the tricky part, the game designer is responsible for all of the states that can be generated by the system, and in more than the obvious way, because of course we are responsible for all of them in terms of them being engaging and interesting choices, but we are also responsible about what those states are saying. But there's a small little thing, there's a little caveat, because outside of normal states, there are also interpretation states. And those states are mostly connected to what the player is imagining, what will happen next, and there's a lot more of player participation in creating of those states. So due to that, we cannot be responsible for them, because there's always that one person that will look on the rock and think about genocide, and this is not on us. But the other states, that on us. But no one cares. Like this sounds like kind of academic, pseudo-scientific thingy. But the thing is, as the medium is getting older and older, players also as an audience get more accustomed to reading the games in more than only surface levels. They start to look at games and they start to look at what the games are saying through the mechanics, not only through the story bits. And we already had few examples of that. We had the Rim Ward queer woman controversy. The situation in here was that there was a certain worldview embedded in the mechanics of those games, how homosexuality and bisexuality of characters worked. And the thing is, the discussion there, it was it was only for fun, but it is not like that. We are speaking through our systems, and it's okay, because I'm not here to tell you, this is the only right way, this is the police thought kind of approach. No, just what is important is to know that we are saying things. And the same for many years what was with video game romance, because if you look on the purely systemic side of video games romance from the old days, those are vending machines for sex. Just like that. You throw in good answers and compliments, and eventually the sex will fall out. And I hope that this is not how relationship works, and this is not how romance works. But those systems were implying and were saying that this is how it is. It was for fun, it was for simplification. But players are starting to read those things, and we are also more aware that we are saying those things through those systems. And it was the same with Frostpunk. Frostpunk actually hit a thingy through its balance, because it was balanced through a really European-centric approach. And as so, when it was received by the Chinese players, it was quite weird for them how we balance certain things, because for us, some things were no-go, for them, they were okay. We were not fully aware that we were saying that thing from that, quite fixed perspective. So, to go into a little bit little bigger details, let's go through the case of Frostpunk and what are you willing to sacrifice for gameplay. And let's look like that kind of authorial voice thinking of what we are saying is impacting the game design. Just to put it a little bit in context, Frostpunk is a survival city building game with a strong society component. So what is important for our story is that if your workplaces are not heated, your people will get sick, and eventually, if they are sick and not treated, an amputation may happen. So we were playing around with that. Amputation happened, but the systemic idea behind that was when an amputation happens, that little human in Frostpunk is taken away from the force, from the workforce. So the player has less resources on that side, so that would be a strong enough incentive to heat all of the places. But as the time progressed, we found out that actually the amount of people that the player has to distribute among workforces is not a problem. He has more people than workplaces. So that kind of incentive was not a thing. It did not work. So we started to discuss what can we do. And as I was responsible for the society, I was like, okay, let's look at this idea. Let's look at all of the systems that we can, what we can poke and stick together to have a stronger incentive for the player to eventually hit those places. So a bigger penalty connected to the amputations. As we already had a system that was connected with the discontent and hope, we started to play with an idea that those people without those limbs may have a chance to commit suicide, which would have a ripple effect, because this is something that has a ripple effect on the community. So this way the player would have stronger incentive outside of moral one to hit those places and do not make that happen. So we implemented that mechanic, played around, set a percentage. I still did not feel the penalty enough, so I tweaked the numbers, played again. Tweak 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 the numbers, played again. Now it was working, and the tester was like, yeah, I feel the incentive. And I looked in the config, and every person after amputation every day had a 50% chance to commit suicide. And now a problem arose, because it worked mechanically, it was engaging, but this was not a worldview that I held, and this is not something that I wanted to say in that game, as this is a semi-realistic game. So eventually we scrapped that idea, and we worked an entirely different system to have that kind of a penalty. We added a special kind of discontent where different people are not part of the workforce. We added protests. We added a lot of additional context to put it a lot of additional content to put it in a correct context, because that was important, and to offer that kind of interesting gameplay. And eventually there was even a law about allowing people with amputations to walk in different places, to have the prosthetics for them. And this is the moment for, self-tap and all of that. But the thing is, not only the systems are the problem, but before we go there, this was not only such a problem in Frostpunk. We touched, because this is a society game, we touch on many different subjects. And some of them are really sensitive, some of them are really important, some of them are everyday experiences of other people. And you cannot treat those things lightly for the sake of entertainment itself. So for some of things, we just cut them out because there was not enough time to kind of, do it the right way. So the best way was to cut it out. And as I'm saying, not only the systems are the problem, because math itself is embedded with meaning. When you are balancing a system, when you are balancing laws, when you are saying how much of people will be mad about one law and another, you are showing your view of the world, because there is no such a thing as an objective algorithm on an objective balance. You are picking what kind of laws is more making people more angry and less, and that decision comes from your internal values. And it's for all of those things, there is no such a thing as no, objectively this is the thing that should add +5, this is the thing that should add +1. So the balance is also the expression of your personal views. And sometimes those are mundane things. You think that the sword is a better attack thing than an axe. But sometimes it's bigger things, like, do you think that immigration makes the crime rate go higher, or does not impact them at all? And just, those things are expression of your personal views, even if you don't want it. So you can imagine how different of a game this War of Mine would be if, for example, the food was plentiful. This is a stupid idea, but this is a depiction of war through the lens of people who made this War of Mine. And the math in there is their depiction of what they think the war is, right? But of course, not all systems are like that. And not all systems require care in those terms. You can have a fully abstract game like Opus Magnum, and there, go wild. Those systems will tell only the story of your imagination about an abstract system of chemical bonds, and that's all. You don't have to be worried. But when rooted in reality, and when showing reality, you show your view of the reality. So when designing or balancing, remember that you are also talking, because your authorial voice as a designer and as an author is embedded in this balance and is embedded in those mechanics. And just, be aware of that, because you can say the most silly thing. Just be aware that you are saying those things. So, I wish you great GDC. Also, happy Pride Month, because I'm recording this in June. And goodbye!